It's great to see you all here, and I really thank all the organizers who've been doing this work and building for it and the logistics today. And the speakers have been magnificent, and I hope you all come back after the intermission to hear the rest of the speakers, Abby Martin, Heidi Choi, Richard Becker, and for more discussion. Those of us in the generations after the Cold War began, and the later generations in the US, we've always been fed in school the myth that North Korea started the shooting, and so the US had to finish it. And I know a lot of this, of what I'm going to say, has been said before, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it. The line to us was always, North Korea invaded the South. How do you invade your own country? It was their country, and it was only divided 5 years before. For the revolutionary forces, it was the War of Liberation to unify Korea, and for the imperialists, it was the war of total destruction and massive carpet bombing to put an end to socialist North Korea. And the war can only be understood in that context of the aftermath of World War II. The horrors of World War II, but also the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and the weakening of all the colonizers after the war, except for the US, which remained unscathed virtually after war. And it was the US that decided it had the chance to dominate the whole world, unchallenged. We should understand the Korean War in the context of a global struggle between two camps that existed. On the one side, the aggressor, US imperialism, had divided the Korean peninsula and was determined to stem the tide of Asian national liberation movements. And on the other side was the socialist camp, the Soviet Union, the socialist countries of Eastern Europe, and the national liberation movements. In August 1945, the nationalist forces in Indonesia declared independence from their Dutch colonizers after the defeat of the wartime Japanese occupiers. Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in September 1945, even though the French tried to militarily retake Vietnam, and we know what happened after. And in 1949, to the great shock of the US imperialists, the great Chinese Revolution emerged triumphant, 1 year before the war. There was a howling debate, and accusations flew among those in the ruling circles over who lost China, as if China belonged to anyone but the Chinese people. And for each war of US aggression in the post-World War II period, there has always had to be a propaganda war. The infamous image created by the CIA and Pentagon of the domino theory, starting with Vietnam and one Asian nation after another falling under the influence. It was in reality the attempt to obscure the US strategy of defeating those national liberation movements. Now, the propaganda against Vietnam, which affected the American people and allowed the war to go almost unchallenged for several years, it was very effectively carried out before in the fierce anti-communism for the people to accept the Korean War. The hysteria against Korea and the parallel hysteria within the United States against communism suppressed any notion that the people of the US might oppose the Korean War. It remains, as others have said, the unknown war, not because it was not known at the time, but because all dissent was subjected to repression, in some cases, extreme repression. And one of those extreme repressions was the Rosenbergs. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested days after the Korean War began, and they were executed on June 19, 1953, 6 days before the armistice was signed. They were used as the symbol of crushing communists and leftists in the United States. They were vilified and falsely accused not only of giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union, they were accused by the judge, the prosecutors, of Truman and later Eisenhower, of being responsible for the Korean War and for the death of every U.S. soldier. Before his and Ethel's execution, Julius Rosenberg said, quote, "This death sentence is not surprising. It had to be. There had to be a Rosenberg case because there had to be an intensification of the hysteria in America to make the Korean War acceptable to the American people. There had to be hysteria and a fear sent through America in order to get increased war budgets. And there had to be a dagger thrust in the heart of the left to tell them that you are no longer going to get 5 years in a violation of the Smith Act or 1 year for contempt of court. You're going to get killed." And it's incredible that despite the loss of 37,000 US soldiers and the astounding slaughter of millions of Koreans in a 3-year war compared to the longer war of Vietnam, that it is unknown to the people of the US. And this ignorance is partly the reason, and maybe one of the biggest reasons, that people can be snowed under today in thinking that Korea is the aggressor, instead of understanding the DPRK's defense as a deterrent to the horrible war that they experienced, the genocide. The other speakers have spoken and will continue on the division that took place and the brutal suppression, as David said, in the independence movement in southern Korea. But I want to shed a little light on the nature of this global class struggle on the Korean Peninsula by 2 quotes from, first, the Soviet commander, and this is from the book published in the DPRK titled Korea, the 38th Parallel North. And this quote shows the attitude by the Soviet military command in the northern part of Korea soon after the liberation by the Korean revolutionaries led by Kim Il-sung, and the Soviet army came in August 1945. The US came in a month later in the south. On August 10, 1945, the Soviet commander Ivan Chistyakov of the 25th Far East Front Army of the Soviet Union addressed the Korean people. An interesting quote. He said, "To the Korean people, Korea has become a free country, but this is only the first page of Korean history. The splendid orchard is the outcome of labor and energetic efforts of the people. Thus, the happiness of Korea can too be achieved by heroic struggle and strenuous efforts of the Korean people. Remember, Korean people, you hold your happiness in your own hands. You have attained liberty and liberation. Now everything is up to you. The Soviet army will provide the Korean people with all the conditions for embarking on free and creative labor. Koreans must create their own happiness themselves." The Soviet army left 3 years later in 1948. What did Douglas MacArthur say? As commander of the US forces that occupied the South, he issued several declarations which were dropped en masse by planes and leaflets over all of South Korea as a warning to the people. In one, he said, "To the people of Korea, all powers of government over the territory of Korea south of the 38th degrees north latitude will be exercised under my authority. Persons will obey promptly all my orders and orders issued under my authority. Acts of resistance to the occupying force or any acts which may disturb public peace and safety will be punished severely." And it goes on and on about the rules. There were other dictates that said there will be punishment up to death. But it was much worse than a series of declarations. It was the US refusing to abide by the desire of the Korean people for true independence, the US maintaining the former Japanese colonizers and Korean collaborators to enforce MacArthur's orders. It was the US forming that extremely reactionary fascist state in the South with fascist youth organizations that later took part in the extermination of what they say was between 100,000 and 300,000 people yearning for independence before the outbreak of the Korean War. And so the propaganda has been very heavy on us, both in the US and in South Korea. I went to North Korea in 1989, and I wanted to come back to study Korean, so I took some classes in San Francisco, and my teacher in our class, there were Korean students and US Army, former Army people, and the teacher said, "Why are you all studying Korean?" And we went around and said, "Why?" And I said, "I went to North Korea." And of course they were shocked. And one young Korean woman said, "I hear that they're very ugly in the North, and that they have long faces and long teeth." And I said, "They're your people. 44 years you've been separated. They're your people." And then 2 years ago, I was in the middle of my classes again. I started taking Korean again. And the teacher asked us again, "Why are you studying Korean?" And I said, "Because I went to the North." And she literally stepped back for a second, and she didn't say anything more. And a few minutes later, she looked at me and said, "You know, North Korea is following you everywhere you go now." And I said, "Actually, the National Security Agency is." And it's funny, because this time, the students knew what I was talking about. So I want to recommend that you look up in the internet 2 books that are published in the TBRK, excellent documentation of the US preparation for the war. And one is called "The US Imperialists Started the Korean War," and the other is "Korea, the 38th Parallel North." It's not an accident that now, with Trump, we're no longer allowed to go to North Korea, but somehow we need to find a way. And even if we can't go to Korea, North or South, we know here we have a great task to tell the truth and let people know of the first war to prevent any future war. Thank you.